So Roy, we have a concept of church today. If we look in Matthew chapter 16 verse 18, when Jesus is talking to Peter after the revelation of who he is, and he says, "You are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church." Now I've got the interlinear Bible here, and the reference to Strong's for ecclesia, if I look in Strong's and I go to the reference, which by the way is 1577, it says ecclesia is a calling out, a popular meeting, or a religious congregation. Now, how does that differ from what is in the Hebrew?
Well, the problem of Stuart, and this is a problem that everyone confronts, is that this material was not originally written in Greek. So what the Greek says is basically beside the point. If it wasn't written in Greek, what was it written in? Well, the fact is that all of the biblical text was written in or based upon Hebrew. And even in the New Testament, you have to look at the Hebrew in order to get the correct meaning or understanding of the text, whatever that text might be. Now, that text to which you're referring is Matthew chapter 16 and verse 18, which says in English, "And upon this rock, I'm going to build my church," whatever that is. Now, in Hebrew, it says, "V'ani omer elecha ki ata Petros," you're Peter, "v'al hasela hazeh evnei et kehilati," and I'm going to build my kahal. Now, there is a question today, as a result of the finding of the Dead Sea Scrolls, whether that passage was actually kahal or whether it was not. In Hebrew, a kahal is an assembly of people, or a congregation. A congregation would actually be probably a better word than assembly, as it's referring to the individuals. And a kahal is opposed to the Greek word ekklesia, in that ekklesia more means called out to an established institution, where a kahal is an assembly, a group of people. But in the Dead Sea Scrolls, an interesting thing happened. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, they found that the people at Qumran, instead of referring to a kahal, called themselves Edah and Adah. And it comes from the Hebrew word laha'id, or to tell. And Adah has to do literally with a witnessing body, that this movement to which Jesus is referring is not some kind of an institution, it's not some kind of a physical building, but it's referring rather to the individuals themselves and what they are doing, that they are witnessing to his divinity, to his messiahship, and it's upon this foundation that Jesus is going to be building his witnessing body, or those that are going out there to proclaim his message.
So just before we go on, we actually have proof that Matthew is originally written in Hebrew, right?
Yes.
But there are people that question whether the Gospels are written in Hebrew, Aramaic, or whether they were written in Greek. But we actually have proof. I mean, we have an old Hebrew script of Matthew, the Shem Tov script, which is old. But we also have proof of the founding fathers who talk about Matthew was originally written in Hebrew.
Yes.
So just so people can understand, we do have proof that this material is Hebrew.
Yes, all of the early church fathers, Papias, Irenaeus, Eusebius, all refer to the original Hebrew gospel of Matthew. The interesting thing about it is, you remember Jerome, who translated the biblical text into Latin about 400 of the present era. He did his translation at Bethlehem. I've been in the little cell where he worked on his translation. And Jerome, in 400 of the present era, said that there was still an original copy of the Hebrew text of Matthew in the library that had been religiously assembled by one Pamphilus at Caesarea in his day, which means by 400 years after the time of Jesus, there were still manuscripts of Matthew that were originally written in Hebrew that were in the library at Caesarea.
So what happened? We have a church emerging in the first century, and we know they're all Jews originally, and you can go into that for us. But what happened that we moved from the witnessing body to what we have as we look around the church today?
Well, it's a long story, and it's actually a disturbing story to a degree, one which most people, they've never studied, they've not been told heretofore, and it's difficult for most people to accept. But what happened in the first century, following the day of Pentecost, those who accepted Jesus as Messiah were all Jews. There were no non-Jews that were admitted into the fellowship of the Ma'aminim, as they called themselves. Ma'amin is simply a believer, and they didn't call themselves Christians or some other term. They called themselves Ma'aminim, and they used that term for many centuries, as a matter of fact, in referring to themselves. And there were no non-Jews that were admitted into that particular fellowship until AD 40. And in 40 of the present era, 10 years after the crucifixion, something interesting happened. You have at Caesarea the conversion of the household of Cornelius. And you remember Cornelius had been a friend of the Jews and had contributed to the synagogue and they accepted him into the fellowship of the Ma'aminim, of the believers. But as years pass, by AD 90, there are so many non-Jews that have accepted Jesus as the Messiah that they're beginning to pose a problem for the Jews. And so they decide that they're going to have to do something. And what they do is interesting. They appoint a rabbi by the name of Shimon Hakatan, or Little Simon, to come in and do something. And he does something interesting. In the daily ritual prayers performed by the Jews, even until today, actually, called the Shemoni Esrei, or the 18 oral prayers, he institutes a 19th prayer, which is a curse against the Minim, as they were called by the Jews. And Minim means a sectarian. And so they pronounce a curse against the sectarians, hoping that it will drive them out of the synagogue. But it doesn't accomplish its desired purpose for one reason, and that is that the prayer was recited orally. And the people stood up and recited the prayer, and they recited it to themselves, and they could be going along and saying one thing, and then it got to that and just ignore it, and never did ever accomplish its desired purpose.
So it was recited silently, right?
That's right.
So just to clarify, this is also the Amidah.
The Amidah.
Yeah.
Yes, it's the Amidah.
Okay.
Now, as a result, by AD 90, as I mentioned, there are more believing Jews, or believers in the synagogue than there are Jews. And according to some authorities, such as Shlomo Penis, who writes just within the last 40, 50 years about the circumstance, says that these believing Jews, or believers, I shouldn't say believing Jews, I should say non-Jews who believe in Jesus as the Messiah. These organizations, or witnessing bodies, or we would refer to them as churches, although that's a misnomer, they existed well into the 4th century of the present era. And most of them who followed Jesus, that are non-Jews, refer to themselves simply as believers, ma'aminim. Now what happens, in answer to your question, about 300 of the present era, the emperor of Rome, a man by the name of Constantine, happens to see a vision that he believes is come to him from God, that he's chosen as the spatial emissary of deity, and he forms what later becomes, over the passing centuries, what we know today as the Roman Catholic Church. And as a result of him converting to Christianity, as it is known then, he decides that he's a Christian, then everybody ought to be a Christian.
Okay, well, let's just pause right there, and in our next segment, I want us to pursue that, and let's talk about how that came about and how we moved from simply being Ada to having these established churches. Thank you for listening. Please click on the share button at the bottom of your screen to share this message with others. To support Dr. Blizzard, please send your financial gifts to the address shown on your screen below.